Hi, my name's Bassi, and this podcast is based on a debate on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that I had with Marcus Hallaby of Workers' Power at the Alliance for Workers' Liberty Summer School in 2010. My starting point is this, that the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is one of competing narratives that differ in their selection, their emphasis and their interpretation of particular events, and which in turn spirit different political responses to the conflict's present-day conditions. In academia, a predominant cross-Atlantic left narrative exists that draws on scholars like Edward Said and Perry Anderson and echoes the socialist left generally, including Workers' Power. This narrative roots the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in ethnic cleansing, and it frames it as essentially a dual camp struggle between, on the one hand, a US imperialist-backed, exploitative, racist, nationalist, colonial state, and on the other hand, a resisting, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist original population. Let's unpack this. For the political geographer Derek Gregory, the key date for many on the Israeli left is not 1948, like for the majority of Palestinians, but 1967, which he deems as problematic because 1967 was a latter war occupying to date the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but was simply further military advance by Israel. In other words, the outcome of 1948, the Al-Nakba, was and remains colonial occupation of Palestine. Ilan Pappé calls for a paradigm of ethnic cleansing to replace the paradigm of war in scholarly and public debate on the question of 1948. Rejecting the notion that the exile of 750,000 Palestinians was the outcome of the war itself, he argues it was the result of long and meticulous planning by the Zionists to ethnically cleanse. Norman Finkelstein argues that the 1948 war was exploited by the Zionists in a similar way to the Serbs' ethnic cleansing of Kosovo during the 1999 NATO attack. He purports that while many Israelis continue to desire the expulsion of Palestinians, ethnic cleansing is now no longer politically viable, so apartheid instead takes its place. Israel's legal foundations are seen as a pre- to post-1948 quest for national and racial purity, as stressed by Said and countless other left-wing academics, tantamount to organised discrimination or persecution akin to apartheid South Africa and or Nazi Germany. The cross-Atlantic academic left narrative concludes, because Israel is historically based on the principle of return and non-return for Jews and Arabs respectively, then if this disappeared, so too would the Zionist nation-state of Israel. Now what I want to do is briefly sketch an alternative distinctly Marxist narrative of key events and conditions of existence that led to the formation of the nation-state of Israel in May 1948. A narrative that I consider critically lost from the academic left and the socialist left. How one reads history informs and is informed by the present-day Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The construction of the narrative that I present is drawn in part from the work of the renowned French independent Marxist scholar and Orientalist Maxime Rodinson. An Orientalist, it is worth noting, who is singled out for praise in Said's famous book Orientalism, and who dismissed Said's book as a polemic against Orientalism written in a style that was a bit Stalinist, i.e. in its delineation of allies and adversaries, in its dual camp delineation in fact. So let's begin. At the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Jewish question was exemplified in a trend towards, on the one hand, segregation in Russia and Eastern Europe, and on the other hand, assimilation in Western Europe. The spirit of third camp Marxism at the time was to aid an independent, internationalist, democratic and proletarian form of the latter being assimilation, developing, as Lenin talks of it, as the great world progressive features of Jewish culture, as against any trend to either local cultural nationalism, which came to be adopted by the Socialist Bund, or the more unequivocal nationalism of political Zionism. The most popular location considered by early Zionist leaders was Palestine, then an Arab province of the Ottoman Empire and commonly regarded as a southern region of Syria. Significantly, concurrent with the development of Jewish national aspiration for Palestine was the development of Palestinian-Arab nationalism. Both developed at roughly the same time. Palestinian-Arab nationalism was an indirect result of British and French colonial expansion into the Ottoman Empire, which imported the very idea of the nation state, and it was a response to early discrete Jewish settlement. It must be accepted that the nature of the Jewish question changed radically with the unprecedented persecution of the Jews in fascist Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. Now, this swung the balance of forces toward the historical inevitability of a Jewish nation. I quote Trotsky, "During my youth, I rather leaned towards the prognosis that the Jews of different countries would be assimilated and that the Jewish question would thus disappear in a quasi-automatic fashion. The historical development of the last quarter of a century has not confirmed this perspective. Decaying capitalism has everywhere swung over to an exacerbated nationalism, one part of which is anti-Semitism. On the other hand, the Jews of different countries have developed their press and developed a Yiddish language as an instrument adapted to modern culture. One must reckon with the fact that the Jewish nation will maintain itself for an entire epoch to come." Maxine Rodinson records how from 1924 to 1931, 29 out of every 100 Jews immigrating to Palestine left after a short stay, with in 1927 more departures than arrivals. What's more, during this period, a majority of Jews in Palestine considered a purely Jewish state as actually unrealistic. Now, Hitler's persecution of the Jews in Europe unleashed a new flood of immigrants to Palestine. Put simply, in Rodinson's words, it was anti-Semitism that played a capital role in gathering together an entire group that was otherwise on the road to disintegration. Zionism played no significant role before 1939. Any significant grassroots appeal for minority binational tendencies within Zionism deceased in favour of its nationalist and exclusivist wing. And this was a consequence of the Holocaust, and it was also a consequence of the contradictory and unpopular role played by British imperialism in Palestine. Let's now consider the question of Zionism, and specifically Zionism's colonial character. Those on the ground who were most attracted to the promise of a Jewish homeland were the persecuted poor of Eastern Europe, who were not, Rodinson observes, colonialist or imperialist in their motivation. The colonial character of Zionism came instead from one element, or, I quote, one small detail that seemed to be of no importance. Palestine was inhabited by another people. Now, Rodinson insists that one ought neither to be shocked nor indignant about this fact. Why? The approach of early Zionist leaders was endemic of 19th and early 20th century European imperialist thinking that territory outside Europe, all territory outside Europe is empty, i.e. a cultural vacuum, and colonial occupation will thus serve as progressive poles of development in these otherwise backward lands. Furthermore, Rodinson maintains it wasn't abnormal for early Zionist leaders to seek an alliance with imperialist powers in exchange for particular favours, with the activities of Theodor Herzl in this respect not dissimilar to the father of Muslim nationalism, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani. The difference, however, and it's a critical difference for sure, was that the Zionist aspiration was realised in 1917 by the British Balfour Declaration, regardless of the U-turns made by the British imperialists thereafter. In brief, The prevailing colonial philosophy in Europe both explains and is responsible for the fact that the actual population of Palestine was generally ignored by early Zionist leaders. The decision in 1947 of the British imperialists to withdraw from Palestine set the ground for an inevitable bloody confrontation. For sure, the colonial conditions could have ended after British withdrawal, with an acceptance of the 47 UN petition plan by the Arab leaders. But of course this would have been considered from the Arab perspective as an amputation of territory to foreigners, and an unacceptable colonial amputation at that. On the 14th of May 1948, the day British troop withdrawal commenced, David Ben-Gurion declared the nation-state of Israel, and as observed by the US socialist at the time, Hal Draper, a new state has been set up. A people have declared that they want to live under their own government and determine their own national destiny. They have taken a blank cheque made out to the right to self-determination, and they've signed their name to it, Israel, and they have sought to cash it in. Now, the basic wrong that was done is this. The Palestinians' right to national self-determination was banished by the claim of another group to the same right on the same territory. I'll repeat that. The Palestinians' right to national self-determination was banished in one and the same moment that the claim of another group was upheld to the same right on the same territory. Now, there's no straightforward correction to this wrong. Any settlement to the conflict today must concede a maximum to democracy for all and a minimum to national chauvinism. That means upholding the right of all groups of workers to national self-determination. The colonial situation can end when the relations of domination, oppression and exploitation end, which means that Israel's post-67 mini-colonial war in the West Bank and Gaza Strip ends. Now, that neither means that the inhabitants of Israel proper must return to their so-called place of origin, nor does it mean that they should be subjected to rule by the original inhabitants of Palestine. Israeli Jewish workers have a duty to align with Arab workers, foremost Israeli Arab and Palestinian Arab, in a social class war. A social class war against their own ruling classes and the wider imperialist and regional imperialist interference and forces. Against these classes, but also they should be engaged in a social class war for the democratic right of Palestinian Arabs to their own independent nation state on continuous territory alongside Israel on pre-1967 borders. I now want to turn to the crux of workers' power's position, the position put forward by Marcus Halaby and his comrades, and I want to pose some responses to this for debate. On the nature of Israel, this is what workers' power say. I quote, "Israel, a racist settler state that is expelling the Palestinians from their land, must be destroyed. Israel can be destroyed in a revolution by mobilising Arab masses of the region and drawing to its side those progressive forces that exist within Israel itself." I ask the following. Are there any other nation states that workers' power have advocated or would advocate the destruction of? Are there any nationalisms or nation states free of racism? Or is it that workers' power consider Israel the most racist state in the entire world ever? On the nature of imperialism and anti-imperialism, this is what workers' power state. Israel is the principal regional instrument of the United States of America for dividing and exploiting the Arab world. I ask the following. Is Israel a puppet state of the United States, or does it only follow the orders of America when it's in its own interest to do so? Are not the relations between Israel and the Arabs more of domination than exploitation, with the economic potential of Israel's technical superiority limited by the smallness of its territory, its economic dependence on European American powers, and the precarious relations it has with the neighbouring Arab states? Workers' Power continue, I quote, "We fight imperialism and support resistance. We demand an end to the Zionist occupation of Palestine. We support unconditionally the armed resistance. We're for an active defeatist position towards the Zionist state in any conflict with an Arab bourgeoisie." So here's my response. Opposition to imperialism is of course a given, but let's run through some more ABCs here. War is a continuation of politics by other forceful means. So, the decision to support resistance to an imperialist power must be based consistently on an assessment of what politics any given side in a war is a continuation of. Now, it's for this reason, during war, socialists should not offer political solidarity to an organisation, movement or government simply on the basis that it is the enemy of our enemy, or has widespread support, or is in or is likely to be in power, or formally adopts a political programme ostensibly unobjectionable, or is successful in winning over more politically progressive elements than its leadership conveys. The decision to offer political solidarity must be on the basis of what is analysed as the real political character and real political programme of its formation. Now, it seems to me that Workers' Power fail to understand the meaning of politics, which entails a decision of what products of capitalism to base ourselves on in their conflict with what other products. For them, they opt for Hamas on the basis of its anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist politics, limiting their critique of Hamas to it can reach its objectives only through negotiation and compromise after a heroic period of bloody self-sacrifice. That's their critique. For us, we base ourselves on the labour movement and other progressive democratic forces, feminists, democrats, secularists, LGBT activists. We base ourselves on these forces in opposition to both imperialism, global and regional, and reactionary anti-imperialism. On a solution to the conflict, Workers' Power state, some on the left argue for a two-state solution under capitalism. This is reactionary and utopian. Amongst the reasons offered, they continue. It denies over 5 million Palestinian refugees in camps across the Middle East their right to return to the land from which they were ethnically cleansed. So the full enactment of the right of return would inevitably lead to the dissolution of the nation-state of Israel. As previously stated, the Palestinians' right to national self-determination was banished. In one and the same moment that the claim of another group to national self-determination was adhered to on the same territory. There's absolutely no straightforward correction to this wrong, especially 6 decades later. As Maxine Rodinston has stated, if the consequences of pressing a just claim are liable to be calamitous and unjust, too fraught with practical difficulties, there may be grounds for suggesting that it be renounced. The wrong done to the Arabs by the Israelis is very real. However, it is only too common throughout history. We may therefore plead with the Arabs to accept the fait accompli. Workers' Power continue. The only progressive way forward for the Palestinian and Israeli peoples is a binational state. Even then, such a solution under capitalism is utopian. The answer is to create a workers' state, an integral part of a united socialist states of the Middle East. A socialist United States of the Middle East would allow for separate states or autonomous regions for every nationality. Couple of points here. One, I think this is totally dishonest because actually Workers' Power's socialist United States is premised on destroying Israel. It's premised on undoing and denying the right of national self-determination to Jewish workers and to Jewish workers alone. Point 2, we have a duty as socialists to concede a maximum to democracy and a minimum to national chauvinism. Why? Because this will create the conditions necessary for long-term Arab-Jewish workers' unity. And the only settlement that does that, in the interim, the only settlement that can do that in the interim is a two nations, two states settlement on pre-67 borders. So some final words. About a decade ago now, sometime in the early millennium, I came across a chart that ranks perpetrators, a strong country or faction on a weak minority, at present or during the last few decades, by a scale of 0, having received no attention at all, to 10, having received full-scale scrutiny. Now, I want to read out this chart. It's not without problems, it's not without admissions, as I'll mention shortly thereafter. But I want to read it out. So it's a chart that ranks perpetrators, strong country, faction on a weak minority, at present in the last few decades, by a scale 0, no attention at all, 10, full-scale scrutiny. So let's begin then at 0. 0, Japan and Ainu. 0, Thailand on southern Muslims. 0, China on Western Muslims. 0.5, the United States on American Indians in the early 20th century, on Afro-Caribbeans until the 60s. 0.5, Australia on Aborigines. 0.75, Romania on Transylvanian Hungarians. 1, Morocco on Western Saharans. 1, Turkey on Armenians. Still on 1. Middle East, the Arab states, the Sudanese Muslims on Christians. We're up to 2. 2, China on Tibet. 2, German far right on Turks. 5, bit of a jump now, Uganda on homosexuals. 5, Saddam's Iraq on Kurds. There's one left, it's 8, Israel on Palestine. So it's not a perfect chart by any means, it's Eurocentric. It's a little dated now. It has obvious omissions like Russia on Chechnya, Sri Lanka on the Tamils. However, I don't think either would be top of the charts like Israel on Palestine at number 8. But it illustrates a wider problematic phenomenon on the left. And what is this problematic phenomenon? The irrational, unbalanced, unsystematic singling out of Israel as a uniquely demonic and despotic state. Indeed, this irrational, unbalanced, unsystematic singling out of Israel goes even further than this. So let's take political actions such as within my own union, calls for an academic boycott of Israel. This singles out the Israeli working class. It singles out this working class as, at best, in need of a political litmus test, not demanded of any other group of workers worldwide, right? Or at worst, it regards the Israeli working class as, in the main, reactionary and the same as its ruling class. Here's a working class implicitly that can be written off. Now, I started this debate by stating that the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is one of competing narratives that differ in their selection, emphasis and interpretation of particular events, and in turn spirit different political responses to the conflict's present-day conditions. For me, the guiding principles of any decent socialist must be those of consistent democracy, political independence of working class agency, and internationalism. So while conceding a maximum to democracy, this translates as the right of all groups of workers who demand it to national self-determination. And on a minimum to national chauvinism, this can only translate to a demand for two nations, two states, the only settlement capable of laying the best conditions possible long-term for Arab workers and Jewish workers to no longer be divided by nationalist and religious demands, but actually to be united in their class. I'll leave it there. Thank you.